Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Contrary to my usual habit, I will try to speak in British English because this video's topic, and possibly that of one or two other two other next videos, will be the possibility that there are moral and even religious allusions, perhaps even theological ones, in the trilogy which is collectively known as The Lord of the Rings, and yes, you guessed it, or you assumed correctly, or you remembered correctly, written by Mr. John Ronald Royal or Ruel Tolkien, a well-known 20th century British writer who actually earned his living largely or mostly as a professor of English literature. He was well versed in the history of the English language. No wonder he made one of his fictional languages in the Lord of the Rings, the Rohirric language, the language of Rohan, resemble Anglo-Saxon or Old English. Professor Tolkien was born in 1892 and passed away in 1973. And already since at least the 1910s, he started to have these fantasies of another world, which eventually became known as the Middle-earth. And he started to sketch those stories. One of his sons, Christopher Tolkien, has done a lot of work since the death of his father to edit his father's unpublished notes and stories and tales. He was the one who compiled the history of the so-called First Ages with a fairly brief overview of the Second and Third Ages and the start of the fourth one, known as the Silmarillion. He compiled later the Book of Lost Tales, the Book of Unfinished Tales, and then many volumes of the history of Middle-earth based on his father's unpublished and or uncompleted tales and stories. Yes, it is true that in the foreword to the Fellowship of the Ring, this trilogy's first volume, and collectively said to the Lord of the Rings as a whole, Professor Tolkien emphasized that he did not want his book to have any intended inner or hidden meaning. He disliked allegory, and in this aspect he was, I think, if not the polar opposite, at least a clear opponent of his good friend Clive Staples Lewis, better known by his initials C.S. Lewis. Incidentally, C.S. Lewis was also a professor of English literature, and he also wrote many books, actually more than Tolkien wrote, at least as far as publication was concerned during the lifetime, although some of C.S. Lewis's books were also compiled after his relatively early death in 1963. C.S. Lewis, of course, is known to millions and millions of people worldwide, whether professing Christians or other religious people, or even secular people, largely for his Chronicles of Narnia books, where he allegorized the Christian gospel Aslan the lion symbolized Jesus Christ, Tash symbolized the devil, and then there were servants of both Aslan and Tash, and then there were these children, maybe 4 of them, who had their adventures, and at least one of them turned to evil, although possibly he repented later. I have not read those books myself. I do remember watching an animated film of them during one Christmas holiday in the early or middle 1980s, or at the latest in 1986, because it happened before my family and I immigrated to Canada in 1987. Anyway, Professor Tolkien emphasized in this foreword to The Lord of the Rings that he considered history, whether real or then imagined or fake, feigned was the adjective that he used, to allegory, or because in his opinion the readers could get much more out of such history because they could apply it in many ways. And as either Meriadoc Brandybuck, better known as Merry, or Peregrine Took, better known as Pippin, told their 3 companions, Aragorn, a man or human being, Legolas, an elf, and Gimli, a dwarf, you must draw your own conclusions about the Ents, these tall tree-like beings whose chief was Fangorn, the tree beard. Either Merry or Pippin tried to describe the Ents, but halted after saying something like, the Ents are, first of all, different, but their eyes are strange, and then he mumbled and then gave this disclaimer, you must draw your own conclusions. What we do know is that Professor Tolkien in his private life was a deeply religious man. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he regularly went to the confession before a British Catholic priest. He also was so conservative in his Catholic faith that when in the early 1960s the Second Council of the Vatican gave the national Catholic churches worldwide the right to decide which language they wanted to use in their liturgy, they had the right to convert or translate most of the Catholic Church services, or rather masses, liturgy from Latin to their local national languages. But as one of Tolkien's grandsons noted, during his last decade or so of life, Professor Tolkien doggedly, stubbornly kept reciting the Masses liturgy in Latin rather than English, as many of the people around him. The only direct religious act, if it may be called so, that could resemble even the Christian prayer, although it was a silent one. And here I'm indebted to a book by an American Episcopalian priest, Ms. or Mrs. Fleming Rutledge, if I remember her name correctly, whose book, The Battle for the Middle Earth, I bought, I think, in the summer of 2009. And in it she drew an astoundingly great number of parallels between the Bible, including the four gospel books, or at least some of them, some of the four, and other books of the Bible as well, and the Lord of the Rings narrative. And if I remember correctly, she said that the so-called standing silence, whose first example came in book 4, that is the second half of the Two Towers, the middle volume of this trilogy, where Faramir, a chief of Gondor and the only surviving son at that time, or by that time, of Denethor II, who was the last ruling steward, or king's substitute, the king's substitute as Gondor's head of state. He gave a sign just before the supper or evening meal to Frodo and Samwise, whom he had taken to that secret refuge of Henneth Annwn, or Window of the Sunset, that they should do likewise. And Faramir explained, so do we all always, looking to the Numenor that was. Numenor was a fictional island kingdom similar to the fabled Atlantis, that because of the wickedness of most of its people then was swallowed up when its king with his army had dared to invade the blessed realm of Valinor, where the Valar, or gods, dwelt. Yeah, thus do we always, remembering, looking towards the Numenor that was, and to the elven home that is, and that which beyond the elven home is and will ever be. And then asked, have you no such custom at meat, meaning at meals? And then Frodo blushed because he felt that he was so uncivilized, and said, no, but if we are guests, we bow to the host, and after the meal we rise and thank him. That do we also, Faramir said. Faramir, after all, was much kinder and much more humble, much gentler than his brother Boromir, who died or was fatally wounded while defending Peregrine and Meriadoc, and definitely a lot gentler and much less power hungry than his father Denethor II, who ended up immolating or burning himself to death because he believed Sauron's lies shown to him in the Palantir of Minas Tirith, that supposedly everything was lost, that supposedly this fleet of black sails meant that the Haradrim from Haradwaith, the southern and hostile neighbor of Gondor, would come to basically finish off the Gondorian and Rohanian armies. But that was not the case. Denethor, in his madness, could not see the fact that Aragorn II, the chieftain of the remnant of the Dunedain in Eriador, had come with a host from southern Gondor, and Legolas, the elf, Gimli the dwarf, and then some 30 fellow Dunedain of the north. And he actually then was the one who decisively led the beleaguered Gondorian and Rohanian soldiers to victory, albeit a dearly bought one. Easily half of them could have been killed. And even and in addition to that, many were wounded. But nevertheless, the Mordorian and their allied armies suffered much greater losses still. Okay, so that standing silence, that habit of the Gondorians before eating their meals, of looking towards the lost Numenor and then the uh, still existing Elvenhome and the always existing Valinor, was the only directly religious ceremony, according to Pastor or Reverend Rutledge. But, well, for example, the words of Malbeth the seer, about the one who would call the oath breakers from their graves to fight against the enemy, resembled, in Reverend Rutledge's opinion, the passage in one of the four gospel books about what happened when Jesus died on the cross, that many righteous people, righteous Jews, rose from the dead, and then after Jesus had risen from the dead, they went up to the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, and appeared to many. At the moment of Jesus' death, there was a mighty earthquake, and as we read in the Gospels, the curtain of Jerusalem's temple was torn in half, meaning that salvation would henceforth be available to people regardless of their nationality, that the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, had served its purpose and would be replaced by the new Messianic Covenant through Jesus Christ. And indeed the defeat of Sauron, well, it can be regarded as some kind of end of an era. However, Tolkien was careful not to allegorize it as the start of the millennial kingdom. He did refer in his book's appendices to the fact that there were still many people, especially the appendix concerning the Rohirrim, that there were still many wicked people to be subdued before Gondor and Rohan, the main kingdoms of the finally liberated western part of the Middle Earth, and actually of those parts of the Middle Earth that had resisted Sauron, the Dark Lord, before they could be at peace. And King Elessar, as Aragorn, took his regal or royal name, and King Eomer of Rohan, who had become his close friend during the War of the Ring, often fought together. And then when Frodo had passed Minas Morgul, he smiled grimly and had decided to complete his quest, and whether any of the wise people like Elrond, the half-elf, or his great friend Gandalf, the wizard, or even Galadriel, the lady of Lothlorien, would know about it, he would still do it. So it was a kind of personal moral responsibility. Even if no one knew of his quest to destroy this magic ruling ring, and with it the Dark Lord, so that Sauron would become just a weak evil spirit, gnawing itself in the shadows and unable ever again to take shape or to grow in power again. And actually it was Frodo who failed his quest. When Frodo had reached the cracks of Doom, or actually that stony cliff from which he could look down to the cracks of Doom, instead of just grabbing his ring and throwing it in the fire, he stood as if he was frozen. And then when Sam, his faithful servant who had not been corrupted by the ring, contrary to Frodo, although he had twice briefly worn it, and although he had had this fantasy of supposedly making the Valley of Gorgoroth into one gigantic garden, but he had rejected those dreams out of hand because he just wanted a little garden of his own to keep, and because he was certain that as long as the ring still existed, Sauron would remain the very powerful and dangerous enemy of the free peoples. So when Sam cried out to, or shouted at Frodo, "Master!" then Frodo turned around or spoke, "I have come, but I will not do what I came here to do. This deed I shall not do. The ring is mine." And then he put it on, and then Gollum knocked Sam temporarily out of action, so that Sam hit his head on the stony floor of Samath Naur, and rushed at the invisible Frodo, because if Frodo was mastered, overcome at last by the lust for the ring, Gollum was even more overcome by it. And ironically, Gollum was originally a hobbit, a Stoor, known as Smeagol, and he had outlived his generation by leaps and bounds. He was at the time maybe over 580 years old, assuming, or even close to 590 years old, assuming that he was born around 2430, because he strangled to death his cousin or relative and friend Deagol, who refused to give the ring to him in or around 2463 of the Third Age of Middle Earth, while the ring was destroyed in the year 3019 of the Third Age. So, and Frodo at the time was only 50 years old, and Sam was either 38 or 39 years old. So they were just babies compared to Gollum. But the ring that Gollum had kept until 2941, when it had slipped from his finger and then had been picked up, as Gandalf later put it in the crucial chapter Shadow of the Past, or the Shadow of the Past, in the Fellowship of the Ring, this trilogy's first volume. Bilbo was the least likely person or individual in the Middle-earth to pick up the ruling ring. And then Bilbo, with the help of the ruling ring, was able to escape Gollum. Otherwise, Bilbo would have been killed and possibly even eaten by Gollum. That was actually the agreement when they had that contest of riddles, explicitly and detailedly described in The Hobbit, to which, or whose sequel The Lord of the Rings was. Anyway, Gollum rushed at Frodo and was able, despite the fact that he could not see Frodo, to fight with him, and even to bite off that middle finger, I think, of his left hand, where Frodo was wearing the ring. And thus Frodo became visible, and obviously he cried out for pain and also the grief of losing the ring, while Gollum just lost his all his restraint, because he was mad with the, just totally crazed by the joy of having recovered his precious, or the ring, after over 77 years of looking for it. But he stepped too far on the edge of that cliff above the cracks of doom, and so he and the ring, with Frodo's bitten off middle finger, fell together to the cracks of doom. As his final shout, Gollum cried out, "Precious!" And then he plunged into the fires of the cracks of doom, and he died. The ring was destroyed. And with it, Sauron, in his visible and powerful form, was also destroyed. His dark tower, or Barad-dûr, collapsed. Orodruin probably exploded. Mount Doom and Samwise and Frodo were rescued at the last moment by Gwaihir, the eagle, and Gandalf, and then were taken to Ithilien, Gondor's traditional eastern province, on the eastern shore of the great river, the Anduin. So we know this narrative. So in the crucial chapter, The Shadow of the Past, there are moral allusions, not necessarily allegories, because the late Professor Tolkien disliked allegories, but moral allusions, and possibly even religious or theological allusions. Why don't we look at the chapter more closely? The great rings could be described, if we tried to allegorize them, although the late Professor Tolkien would not like it, as basically sins, enticing sins. For example, pride and greed, the lust for power, and so forth. Mind you, one of Gandalf's fellow wizards, or Istari, Saruman, fell into this lust for power, and he is actually described as the epitome of a power-hungry politician or some other leader who had been corrupted by his desire to study too deeply the forbidden fruit, in this case the law of rings. And in the Council of Elrond, Gandalf actually quoted Saruman as having declaimed or recited to him that speech that he had long rehearsed in Orthanc back in July 3018. Incidentally, just days after Boromir, then the oldest son, or the older son of Denethor II, had set out on that quest for Imladris, or Rivendell, the dwelling place of Elrond, the half-elf and many other elves near the Misty Mountains, because he had seen that and heard that message, "Go and seek the broken sword. In Imladris it dwells. Greater counsel shall there be taken than the power of Morgul spells. But doom is at hand. Isildur's bane shall be found. The halfling forth shall stand," or something like that. So after first mocking Gandalf, who had used his full name Saruman the White. "Have you indeed, Gandalf the Grey?" he scoffed. "For aid? It has seldom been heard of that Gandalf the Grey sought for aid, one so cunning and so wise, wandering about the lands and concerning himself in every business, whether it belongs to him or not." And then when Gandalf said, "But if I am not deceived, things are now moving which will require the union of all our strength." "That may be so," Saruman replied, "but the thought is late in coming to you. How long, I wonder, have you concealed from me the head of the council, that is the White Council, composed of at least Saruman and Gandalf among the 5 wizards or Istari who had come some 2,000 years before from the Valinor, the Blessed Realm Valinor, and then the greatest of the Eldar or elves of the Middle Earth, such as Elrond and Galadriel. A matter of greatest import. What brings you from your lurking place in the Shire?" "The 9 have come forth again," answered Gandalf. "They have crossed the river," meaning Anduin, "so Radagast said to me." And then Saruman basically just spoke out of the abundance of his heart. His heart was full of mocking, even of other wizards. "Radagast the Brown, Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him. For you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colors." And his robes or clothes were actually woven of all colors. And then when Gandalf said, "I liked white better," Saruman again mocked. "White! It serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed. The white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken." And when Gandalf wisely and calmly remarked, "In which case it is no longer white. And he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom," then again Saruman heaped more mocking and scorn on him. "You need not speak to me as to one of the fools that you have taken for friends. I have not brought you hither to be instructed by you, but to give you a choice." But Gandalf, he was kind to the simple-minded people, and especially those of them who were, at least, to quote him when he comforted Peregrine Took, who had, out of excessive curiosity and selfishness and maybe even greed, looked at the Orthanc stone and had seen horrible visions of the Nazgul or Ringwraiths and even of Sauron. Those who were honest fools, who were at heart good people but who just were not wise. Gandalf was patient and kind and even pitying towards them and sympathetic. Saruman, by that time, or probably already by the 30th century of the Middle Age, of the Third Age, certainly by 2953, was had none of those qualities anymore. And then came his rehearsed speech. "The elder days are gone, the middle days are passing, the younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men, which we must rule. But we must have power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. I said we, for we it may be, if you will join with me. A new power is rising. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order. All the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak and idle friends. There need not be, there would not be any real change in our designs, only in our means. Gandalf was not deceived by Saruman's rhetorical skills, although many other individuals, including possibly even Radagast, who was honest at heart, but who became enamored by the animals and birds of Middle-earth, would have been. Saruman, replied Gandalf, I have heard speeches of this kind before, but only in the mouths of emissaries sent from Mordor to deceive the ignorant. I cannot think that you brought me so far only to weary my ears. And then Saruman still tried to persuade Gandalf to join him, to cooperate with Sauron, no longer to oppose him. And why not, Gandalf? Why not? The ruling ring. If we could command that, then the power would pass to us. That is in truth why I brought you here. For I have many eyes in my service, and I believe that you know where this precious thing now lies. Is it not so? Or why do the Nine ask for the Shire? And what is your business there? And Saruman's eyes betrayed his lust for the One Ring, and Gandalf was keen enough morally and, I may say, even spiritually, to see that. And Gandalf said, seriously and steadfastly, Saruman, only one hand at a time can wield the one, and you know that well, so do not trouble to say we. But I would not give it, nay, I would not give even news of it to you, now that I learn your mind. You were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. Have you others to offer? Then Saruman answered coldly and threateningly, Yes, I did not expect you to show wisdom, even in your own behalf, but I gave you the chance of aiding me willingly, and so saving yourself much trouble and pain. The third choice is to stay here until the end. And then Gandalf asked, Until what end? Until you reveal to me where the one may be found. I may find means to persuade you, or until it is found in your despite, and the ruler has time to turn to lighter matters to devise, say, a fitting reward for the hindrance and insolence of Gandalf the Grey. Or he was being hypocritical, he himself was insolent, not Gandalf. And then Gandalf, to try to say something in reply, said, That may not prove to be one of the lighter matters. And then for over 2 months, until September the 18th, 3018 of the Third Age of Middle-earth, he was imprisoned. And then Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, the same eagle who rescued, together with Gandalf, Sam and Frodo from the destruction of Orodruin, rescued Gandalf and bore him all the way to Rohan, to Edoras, and there he saw how King Theoden of Rohan had fallen into premature old age and had believed Saruman's and Wormtongue's lies. Wormtongue was his wicked counselor who was Saruman's secret ally. And he refused to listen to Gandalf's warnings about Saruman. He just wanted Gandalf to leave as quickly as possible, and then Gandalf chose, against Theoden's wishes, Shadowfax, a very fast Rohanian horse. And then, if I may, in the first one of these videos, choose a passage from Minas Tirith, the first chapter of Book 5, and likewise of The Return of the King. Gandalf had a kind of a verbal debate with Denethor II. And Denethor basically was saying that he, and he alone, would rule Gondor unless the king should come again. Denethor was clearly more concerned with power than with preserving good things compared to Gandalf. And unknown to Gandalf yet at the time, but it became known by the time Denethor spoke to him defiantly and crazedly, and then immolated himself. Denethor had been looking at the Palantir probably ever since he became the ruling steward of Gondor in 2984, so for about 35 years. And had eventually been ensnared by Sauron in the sense that he started to despair, believing Sauron's victory to be inevitable. This quotation comes from, or paraphrase comes from, the Book of Unfinished Tales. Let's see. Yes. When Denethor showed some desire to reconcile with Gandalf by saying, "And you, my lord Mithrandir," he called Gandalf Mithrandir in the same way as the elves, "shall come too, as and when you will. None shall hinder your coming to me at any time save only in my brief hours of sleep. Let your wrath at an old man's folly run off, and then return to my comfort." "Folly?" said Gandalf. "Nay, my lord, when you are dotard, you will die. You can use even your grief as a cloak. Do you think that I do not understand your purpose in questioning for an hour one who knows the least?" In other words, Peregrine took about Boromir's death, while I sit by. And then Denethor verbally, we could say, snapped or lashed out at Gandalf. "If you understand it, then be content. Pride would be folly that disdained help and counsel at need, but you deal out such gifts according to your own designs. Yet the Lord of Gondor is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy. And to him there is no purpose higher in the world as it now stands than the good of Gondor. And the rule of Gondor, my lord, is mine, and no other man's, unless the king should come again." "Unless the king should come again," said Gandalf. "Well, my lord steward, it is your task to keep some kingdom still against that event, which few now look to see. Here I would even say there could be an allusion to the words of Jesus. Yet when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? But this, of course, is a Christian interpretation of that passage. It can be interpreted in many other ways, and I do not claim to have the only possible interpretation. In that task you shall have all the aid that you are pleased to ask for. But I will say this, the rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor nor any other, great or small. But all worthy things that are in peril as the world now stands, those are my care. So here Gandalf clearly contrasted himself, and positively contrasted himself in a moral sense, with Saruman, who had become enamored of political power. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail of my task, though Gondor should perish. If anything passes through this night that can still grow fair or bear fruit and flower again in days to come. For I also am a steward. Did you not know? In fact, in the Book of Unfinished Tales, it was even said in one chapter, I think, about the Istari or the Palantir, that Gandalf was even considered the last manifestation of Manwe, the Elder King, the ruler of the Valar. Okay, before the end of this video, I even would like to quote briefly from the last exchange of words between Denethor and Gandalf. When Gandalf encouraged Denethor to come and fight against the Mordorians, the Haradrim, the Easterlings, and other enemies. Come, we are needed. There is much that you can yet do. Then Denethor laughed, but this was wicked, even diabolical laughter, and then he held up the Palantir. Pride and despair! Didst thou think that the eyes of the White Tower were blind? Nay, I have seen more than thou knowest, grey fool. For thy hope is but ignorance. Go then and labour in healing. Go forth and fight, vanity. For little space you may triumph on the field for a day, but against the power that now arises there is no victory. To this city only the first finger of its hand has yet been stretched. All the east is moving, and even now the wind of thy hope cheats thee and wafts up undoing a fleet with black sails. The west has failed. It is time for all to depart who would not be slaves. Such counsels will make the enemy's victory certain indeed, said Gandalf. Hope on then, laughed Denethor. Do I not know thee, Mithrandir? Thy hope is to rule in my stead, to stand behind every throne, north, south, or west. I have read thy mind and its policies. Do I not know that you commanded this halfling, meaning Peregrine, here to keep silence, that you brought him hither to be a spy within my very chamber? And yet in our speech together I have learned the names and purpose of all thy companions. So, with the left hand thou wouldst use me for a little while as a shield against Mordor, and with the right bring up this ranger of the north, meaning Aragorn, to supplant me. But I say to thee, Gandalf from Mithrandir, I will not be thy tool. I am steward of the house of Anarion. I will not step down to be the dotard chamberlain of an upstart. Even were his claim proved to me, still he comes but of the line of Isildur. I will not bow to such a one, last of a ragged house long bereft of lordship and dignity. What then would you have, said Gandalf, if your will could have its way? I would have things as they were in all the days of my life, answered Denethor, and in the days of my long fathers before me, to be the lord of this city in peace, and leave my chair to a son after me who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. Here he was mockingly referring to his younger and only surviving son, Faramir, who was fond of Gandalf. But if doom denies this to me, then I will have naught, neither life diminished, nor love halved, nor honour abated. To me it would not seem that a steward who faithfully surrenders his charge is diminished in love or in honour, said Gandalf. And at the least you shall not rob your son of his choice while his death is still in doubt. And then Denethor tried to kill Faramir, who was delirious in fever, with a knife, but Beregond, one of the ordinary soldiers of Gondor and Minas Tirith, prevented him from doing so. So, cried Denethor, thou hadst already stolen half my son's love. Now thou stealest the hearts of my knights also, so that they rob me wholly of my son at the last. But in this at least thou shalt not defy my will, to rule my own end. Come hither, he cried to his servants. Come, if you are not all recreant. And then he quickly snatched a torch from the hand of one of his servants and then sprang back into the house rough Dinan, and before Gandalf could prevent him, he lit up the fuel and then leaped on the table, and then he broke the staff of his stewardship and cast the pieces into the blaze, and bowed and laid himself on the table, clasping the palantir with both hands upon his breast. Gandalf was so horrified and grieved that he closed the door. And Denethor then shouted loudly before dying. And apparently ever after, unless someone was so strong-willed as to turn the palantir of Minas Tirith to some other matter, he saw only two aged hands withering in flame. So Denethor fell into despair and madness and committed suicide. Saruman eventually was killed by his oppressed slave, Wormtongue, in Hobbiton, the Shire. Very, very bad. But Gandalf, who remained faithful to his purpose, then departed at the end of the Third Age, along with many elves such as Galadriel and Elrond, and, mind you, Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. But I will continue discussing this topic in the next video at least.